Ok. Obrigado para me convidar. Eu falo também português quebrado, por isso eu prefiro falar em inglês. And I understand we are short of time. We were supposed to have 40 minutes, and we have less time, I understand. So I was asked to come here and share with you our experiences for working in Africa. And sitting here and listening to particularly Plinio and also Andres, I would say, well, this we also heard 6-7 years ago. This was the reason why we tried to start in Africa. Though it's even more impressive what has happened over the last years, of course. But this seminar actually said in the invitation that what are the prospects for expanding production of biofuels to African countries in an environmentally friendly and sustainable way? Well, shortly I can say what's happening right now. There are some projects trying to utilize the honey or the molasses that is left over from the sugar production. Well, actually most of that is being used for human drinking purposes. There are regulatory preparations in some countries to actually include blend up to 10%. There is an exemption, that is Ethiopia, and there's a major program going on, particularly supported by India and China. And that is a really major national program, which is quite impressive. Except for that, it's really the question is why isn't more happening in Africa? Well, we started our journey actually by going to Brazil for very much the reasons we heard from both Andres and Plinio. The national conditions, as we saw, in Africa are as good or actually even better, this is what we believe today, than they are in Brazil. And there is an emerging market coming, particularly through the regulations in North America and in Europe. And there is a tremendous need for development in Africa. And as we heard, the sugar industry has been one of the major drivers for development in the Sao Paulo region and in Brazil, as well as in Mauritius and South Africa and major areas in India as well. So it is a proven driver for development, which actually Africa needs. So all the ingredients are in place. Just do it. And that's as well as we think today. That's exactly the mind we had when we started in 2005. So I think the question that should be asked, though, very often in these kind of seminars, why should it be developed? Achieving what? Serving whose interest? So our perspective for starting this, and we started this from the platform of SEKAB, who is the largest importer of Brazilian ethanol for Europe for the last 10 years, well, is really about peak oil and climate change. We just foresaw that there will be a shortage of ethanol. Unfortunately, that shortage came much quicker than we had actually anticipated. But also to establish ethanol as a commodity in Europe. There was no way for us to convince the Volkswagen, the Ford, the Scania, the Volvo, that they would take ethanol seriously. As we only had a small portion of agriculture ethanol, and then there is only one exporting country, and that is Brazil. And that is not the trustworthy combination. And then, as a company, we also had to reduce the dependency on a few actors in Brazil. Basically 3-4 actors controlling the whole exports of Brazilian ethanol. And that is not the trustworthy platform to build for future commodity as well. And of course, establish a new level of sustainable platform for production in Africa. We had seminars already in the early 2000, how we could foresee Chinese and others coming in and actually making all the mistakes you can dream of and destroying this whole opportunity of producing sustainable long-term ethanol. Basically apply the best proven practices. And of course, there is a big business opportunity, both in short-term and long-term. Short-term because you have the tariff advantage. There is no import tariff to Europe if you take it from Africa, which is roughly $250 per cubic meter. And long-term, the natural conditions are fantastic. So you can use the short-term advantages to build up the industrial platform. And then the conditions are as good as we today believe, actually they are better than in Brazil. I'll come back to that. Well, these are the drivers we heard from Plinio, European Union having these mandates, US 20%. Actually, Sweden, where we are coming from, we have now basically an agreement in Parliament, both by government and opposition, that after 2030, no vehicles should be sold that are only dependent on fossil fuel in order to be independent from fossil fuels by 2050. And that includes heavy vehicles, not only light motorcycle vehicles, because you are consuming much, much more diesel than you consume gasoline. Well, what is the Brazilian perspective? Why did we go to Brazil? Well, first of all, we thought it was the interest of Brazil also to broaden the market for ethanol, to make ethanol into global commodity. And for that, you need more producers. We also thought it would be interesting for Brazil to find a market for exporting know-how and exporting goods. We also thought that it would be interesting for Brazil to be present in this development, to basically to maintain the leading role, which is totally focused on Brazil today, but also looking into Africa, which is by far the largest potential for bioenergy on the earth. And of course, we also believe that there is a geopolitical game going on, and here is an opportunity for Brazil to really become a true ally with these countries. We also to bring in the host countries' perspective. For them, it's very similar to the driver for Brazil was in the 70s. It's about economical and social development. It's about modernizing the agriculture sector. The country we are focusing most right now is Tanzania and Mozambique. Tanzania today, 70% of agriculture is handheld today. 20% by oxes, and less than 10% is mechanized. And there's huge areas of arable land, but you have to modernize. Otherwise, you are stuck in poverty and subsistence farming forever. Food security is priority one. That's the politically priority one. Reduce dependence on imported food and energy, but still food security is still more important because oil is still available. I think that will change quite soon. And then land for foreigners is a very emotional issue. It's not a logical issue, it's really an emotional issue. And that is as important as anything else. But there are other players, and as we ended up, in the beginning we were targeting commercial banks and commercial players. The first product we're heading for right now is basically totally being financed by development banks, and these are international, development agencies. And it's really about trying to support Africa to modernize agriculture through developing the sugarcane industry. And everyone knows that agriculture is the most important factor for actually developing the economy. I will share with you some numbers on population growth, but actually if you don't get development happening quite soon in Africa, you're running into chaos. And also ecological deterioration. Just Tanzania is, according to FAO, losing 400,000 hectares a year in deforestation. And particularly, it's now 80% of fuel is done by biomass, and more people moving into the cities, more being done with charcoal. And the amount of deforestation done by charcoal is stunning. That's enormous risk for long-term deterioration of the ecological systems. And of course, make Africa less fossil dependent, because the dependency on fossil energy is increasing right now. But these development agencies are very sensitive for, let's say, NGOs and for the perceived sustainability. And I think here Brazil has a very important role to play, to share the role around the world, what actually it can provide. And not really having, let's say, the American way of corn. World population has grown from 2.5 billion people after the Second World War to 7 billion last year. This is the last projection coming from United Nations that came in April last year. We will most likely be 8 billion people by 2025, 9 billion people by 2045, and hopefully we can level off at 10 billion people by 2075. It's one planet, one closed system, and there is a limit of natural resources. What we were focusing on, and we are still, and I worked with this for 20 years actually, I was enlightened by the Rio 92, the Rio Conference. conference that understand what sustainability is all about. And I've been working with ethanol since then. And really, it's about the unsustainable balances in oil. This decade, we will consume 4 times more oil that we're finding new resources. If the Brazilian resource right now, which is one of the most astonishing I've found the last 10 years, is at 15 billion barrels or even be 30 billion barrels, well, the world consumes 33 billion barrels in a year. So that's what it adds to the global reserves. Of course, it's big for Brazil, but it doesn't change much from the global perspective. And of course, the consumption of oil is increasing extremely rapidly. These are, the non-OECD countries that in 5 years have increased by almost 70% of the capacity of Saudi Arabia has. So that's one driver. The other driver is climate change, as we heard. And you have seen this before Plinio, and this was before you had problems with climate change here on the sugarcane. We could see that climate change will create problems where you have lack of water, there's too much water, and actually it will make agriculture unreliable around the world. And that's today when it's 390 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What we hoped in Kyoto was that we can level off at 450 ppm. That's far. The most likely now is that we make it at 500 ppm. That's where we're heading towards. And that's a nightmare, of course. So we are burning the candle from 2 sides, getting short of fossil fuel, and we're also reducing our capacity to use arable lands because climate change is also make it more unreliable to use it. So these are the drivers, both from a global perspective, and these were the drivers we saw that are unavoidable. So that's why Africa comes in. Just to remind you that both China and US is larger than Brazil. So you can replace US here and put in Brazil. It is huge. Of course, not entire Africa is usable for arable land, but the idea is to bring in what we heard about the Brazilian model. It's a proven model where you can produce renewable fuel for transport and renewable power from sugarcane in a sustainable, closed, ecological system. According to FAO, there are 600 million hectares of unfarmed land in that yellow area. Only 10%, there are 600 million hectares, only 10% of that is being used today. The agroecological conditions are very similar to what you have here in Brazil, where you are actually having your sugarcane. Today, I assume you have roughly 9 million hectares under cane. And I had different numbers, but let's say you have another 40 million hectares that has been sown for sugarcane. 65, fine. That's why the response from Brazil hasn't been that high. Why should Brazilian industry go to Africa, where you have so much land to develop here? But India and China, they don't have more land, and particularly don't have more land with water for sugarcane. And that's why the drive now is coming from India and China to develop the industry. But they don't have the same experience as Brazil. And that's a mismatch of appetite and experience. The other thing is that Africa doesn't only have land. Africa has a tremendous potential to modernize this agriculture sector. For the last 50 years, the productivity hasn't improved at all. So by just reaching half of what Latin America or Brazil have done, Africa can be self-sufficient in food and actually be net exporter of food. So just using the existing land can easily be self-sufficient and exporting and still have this enormous amount of land available for development. So that was our view, that was our perspective. That's how we came there in 2005, where we started in Brazil. We met Minister of Agriculture, Unica, some players in Brazil. Why don't we share and try to do this together? At that time, we estimated there were about 400 projects in Brazil. And with this enormous capacity in Brazil, in Africa, 0. Some production of sugarcane, but you don't have this agro-energy concept of doing both fuel, power, and sugar. At the same time, Africa will be most hurt by climate change and the rapid increase of oil prices because they are the poorest. Secondly, the opportunity to do exactly what's been done here in Brazil is fantastic, to apply that for development in Africa. So that's the logic, which I say is the same today as it was 7 years ago. So we started and say, just do it. But we have to remind ourselves that it's far, far behind Brazil and India on the industrial development curve. So, as being the largest importer of Brazilian or sugarcane ethanol to Europe, we were approached by quite a few players that were interested to export. And we realized that everyone was just talking about doing one project. One project in Angola, another project in Mozambique, a third project in Senegal, someone doing a project in Kenya or so. But well, I lived 4 years here in Brazil. We worked with Brazil for 15 years. Well, when you go to SEKAB and Sartozinho, you understand it's an industry. It's a scale efficiency. There is a critical mass. There is you are reaching, let's say, central excellence. So by doing one project, scattered place like that, everyone starts from zero, and no one really gets that kind of scale efficiency. So the plan from day one was trying to replicate really what you have here is not in the same size, of course, but still try to replicate the efficiency of scale and also the knowledge. Try to find areas where you can do a project, but then over time you can do more projects in the same areas. And very rapidly we realized, talking to the Dini, talking with the Indians and others, you very rapidly go down the cost curve on both the CapEx and the OpEx. And that's the big disadvantage for the African industry today. So we basically scouted entire Africa, West Africa, South Africa, East Africa. We decided after about 8 months to focus on Tanzania and Mozambique. We signed an MOU with the government of Tanzania and the government of Mozambique in 2006. We set up basically trying to jointly with them, trying to develop a competitive industry, apply the Brazilian and Indian model, but in an African context. Make sustainability into competitive advantage, us coming from Sweden and being squeezed in this debate about is ethanol sustainable or not. We really learned the hard way. If you're on the wrong side, you are really shot down very quickly. On the other hand, it has to be sustainable, so it's an opportunity. And develop these economical, let's say, industrial clusters to become globally, industrially competitive. And set up a local organization and find partnerships. Do it. So, on sustainability, first of all, in Africa today, most of the areas where they clear the land, they burn the land. So in most of these methods of calculating carbon dioxide and so on, they assume that the land is being burned. Well, we wouldn't do that. Actually, Sweden is a third world country. Bioenergy is the single largest source of energy in our country because we are doing heat and power from basically trees. So it's a resource. So it's a no burning policy, make usage of the biomass to produce electricity. Secondly, go for 100% mechanical harvesting, both to close the circle on ingredients and nutritions, but also to make much better usage of the fuel, of the energy, so you can produce more power. But also to increase the soil, the quality of the soil over time. 5 to 7 years, we will replace the carbon that is being released when you basically open up the land for new land. And in up to 14 years, we can actually double the amount of carbon in the soil by building up the carbon again, because it's usually very fatigued soils in these areas. Well, we all know it's fossil-free, the production of it. This is where the oil comes into the production. In 2006, we did this verified sustainable ethanol together with some large players in Brazil. And we realized that in the production, that's where the oil comes in the equipments, and the transport from the production to the harbor. That's basically where the fossil content comes in. So we've been working, as you probably know, since the late 80s. We have about 800 buses in Stockholm today. I'm glad to hear now that Sao Paulo have 60 buses. We are importing your ethanol to drive our buses. We've done that for 20 years. So I'm happy now to see that you are using your own fuel to do the same thing. Because we have to replace diesel as well, not only gasoline. And it's Scania buses, and unfortunately there's only one player in the world yet that actually do these heavy engines that can operate with the diesel cycle. But they're also moving into trucks, and that's where we need your drive, because you have the market and you can create that market. But the intention, we have a letter of intent with Scania that we get their trucks, that we can work with ethanol trucks using our own ethanol. And then, of course, it is to maximize the capturing of the solar energy, as we heard, and that is to get the right feedstock, to have a sustainable farming and water usage. In the long run, it's not the limit of land that is the problem in Africa, it's water. And so we have really focused a lot on the water issue as a sustainable issue focus. So we decided already in 2007 to set up a 200-hectare demonstration farm with subsurface drip irrigation with fantastic yields, under 130 tons. And also, as we have focused on cellulose technology, the intention is to introduce the cellulose to make use of the bagasse. So we have a letter of intent with SEKAB for the hardware and also with Novozymes, so we're providing enzymes. So having about, with irrigation now, we will have at least 100 tons of cane per hectare. Out of that we can make 8,000 liters of ethanol today. With making use of the bagasse, you can make another 4,000. Out of the same amount of area and more importantly, the same amount of water. So the plan is to really in a phase 2 in the first product to do what we call a demonstration plant. Major interest from the development banks and others to get this to happen in Africa actually. So I don't have time to dwell on all the other sustainability issues, but it's about farming with sustainability. It's to have a social sustainable development around this because this product has a major impact when they're actually developing them, but also to develop the domestic market. I will spend more time on that. But really see it as a business opportunity, lowering the risk in the products, and also we know we can get the premium on the products if it can be proven that it's more sustainable. So basically that's the business idea. So we focus on Tanzania and Mozambique. We did a 6-month study where we basically took from northern Tanzania to southern Mozambique. We did satellite studies. We had experts from Brazil, from Mauritius, from South Africa, local experts. Actually, we found 2 areas, one in southern Tanzania, one in northern Mozambique, where we can do up to 200,000 hectares of planting cane. So we can see these clusters to be developed. 5 to 8 products initially in Mozambique. We set up a demonstration farm already in 2008 there, proving that we can grow sugarcane up there. We also tested sweet sorghum. So we tested 24 varieties of sweet sorghum with the Indians, narrowed it down to 4 varieties. So we can combine sweet sorghum with sugarcane in the future. Water is the limiting factor. Sweet sorghum needs less water than sugarcane. In Tanzania, as I said, we have the demonstration farm, and there we had this area in the Rufiji, which is the second largest river in East Africa. It's 150 kilometers to deep sea port, and there is a paved road all the way down there. So it's an excellent kind of location for large scale, good soil, good access to water, close to infrastructure. 8 to 10 projects, each could be like 2.5 million tons of crushing sugarcane. However, starting with a smaller project as a stepping stone. So in the Brazilian terms, it would be like taking all this area from northern Brazil, 300 kilometers from the coastline, having an area of 200,000 hectares, more or less at latitude in Tanzania, and this would be the Mozambique if you take the Brazilian latitude. But the difference is, it's the same natural conditions, close to ports, but exporting to Europe, there is no tariff. And that can offset a lot of the other disadvantages. And of course, I missed one argument from you, Plinio, when you talked about cost of sugarcane. I think it's really the marginal cost for the new projects that sets the price for the market. And I think the new projects are getting further and further inland. So it's not the old project that sets the price for the future market. And I think this is very much where the new projects, and they also need more investments in irrigation and so on. So, well, what happened? Well, Brazil has another 40 projects. How many do we have in Africa? I claim it's still 0. There are still sugarcane projects. There are a lot of projects on the drawing board. There are projects being built actually in Ethiopia, some in Sierra Leone, but nothing really happened. Why so? And I think that was the theme of this seminar. Well, why isn't more happening? Well, I think, again, we have to look back and see what were the drivers for Brazil. And I think to understand what were the drivers, really. Before coming there, of course, we have to understand what are the host countries' perspective. And I already mentioned these perspectives. However, you cannot kind of overlook the reality that in 2008 there was a major drive for this. BP was there, Statoil was there, all the big players were there. They had plans to really develop this. And then you had the fuel versus food debate, and then you had the crash of the oil prices, the financial community. Basically, everyone disappeared. In 2009, 2010, everyone disappeared. And we were there, we were planning to actually start the first project in 2009, which was actually totally impossible. So we had to basically survive on oxygen for about a year and a half until, let's say, reality came back again. But it was, I wouldn't wish my worst enemy to go through the same kind of thing, but it was also a very, very learning process. And we changed pretty much the view since then. Coming back to this one, and this is one of the things I want to share with you, which I think is the difference from the external perspective to understanding a more local perspective. In 1950, the 20 most populous countries were these 20 countries. There were 2.5 billion people on this planet. Well, Nigeria was the only sub-Saharan country, one of these 20 most populous countries. This is an Italian-Brazilian event, so here you have Brazil and Italy. In 1950. In 2010, 60 years later, there are 3 countries from sub-Saharan Africa. Now we've gone from 2.5 billion to 7 billion people. China and India has grown with 1.7 billion people during this time period. And the average growth in China was 1.5%. Still, though, China had one China policy since the mid-70s. India had 2%. Where is Brazil and Italy? Well, Italy is not among the 20 most large countries any longer. But Brazil is huge. And actually, Brazil has grown far faster than India. Brazil has grown with an average of 2.2% over these 60 years. The projection from the United Nations is by 2050, we will be roughly 9 billion people, and then you will have 6 countries from sub-Saharan Africa among those 20 most populous countries. Actually, Brazil is expected to reduce population. It's becoming a very developed country. Tanzania pops up here now, 138 million. And in 2100, and this is the UN projections, and actually, I don't know if you know Hans Rosling, but I went these numbers through with him. He's one of the most popular persons on the YouTube. He has this about population growth worldwide, these bubbles going. You've probably seen that. And so this is the best data that exists in the world. And in this case, Tanzania will have about 300 million people. And that will be, Africa is the continent where all population growth will be during this century. And that changes very much the perspective. Tanzania, as we're focusing on, is expected to either, depending on how population growth develops, but if it has the same population growth as Brazil had the last 60 years, it will be more than 300 million people. The lowest scenario, because doing a project we cannot have a 100-year perspective, we have a 20-year perspective. The lowest scenario, it will be 77 million people by 2030. And that has a major impact on demand. So gasoline demand will triple. Sugar demand at least will triple, up to 1.5 million ton. And also electricity, actually the local demands are expected to be higher, but this is the World Bank assumptions. So history has shown already that the consumption of oil has grown 7% on average during the last 13 years. Actually, last year it grew more than 10%. So oil and sugar imports, actually Tanzania imports 40% of the sugar today. 35% more than last year. On oil, it is 40% more in US dollar terms than last year. Actually, 45% of all export revenue has been spent on oil imports during the last year. Actually, it gobbles up all the foreign aid in only 7 months just to pay for the oil imports. Tanzania has land and water to be self-sufficient on sugar and fuel. Very similar to Brazil. So it's a matter of developing an industry to be self-sufficient. Not particularly to be a major exporter, to be self-sufficient in the first step, which was also the driver for Brazil to develop ethanol. So we work with the government very closely the last year and a half. The projected sugar consumption, and this is still assuming that the consumption of sugar is 20 kilo per capita by 2030. Today in Brazil, I think it's 60 kilos. The existing industry can only grow to a certain level. And this is the projection for the shortage of sugar. So the objective is to be, first of all, self-sufficient on sugar, and then develop an industry that also can do biofuels and power. And for that, attract an industry that can provide these services. So the idea is trying to be self-sufficient by 2020 and then grow with the domestic demand. And do power. In this case, if you do the high-pressure boilers, you can do about 2 million megawatt hours or 2 terawatt hours. And then do ethanol, about 1 million cubic meter of ethanol. It still won't replace all the oil for domestic usage. So the Brazilian model we went with was to do power and ethanol. However, this was really what Brazil did. Brazil started with sugar. And then came power and ethanol. And I think it will be the same in Africa. This is what we can learn the long way. So in Brazil, it wasn't specifically ethanol. It was integrated with sugar production and power. It was a very strong internal market that reduced uncertainty for developing the ethanol industry. It was an existing supply structure for sugarcane and process industries, which reduced the perceived risks. You don't have that industry in Africa today. It was seen as a strong driver for rural economic development. It was a tangible measure to reduce dependence on oil imports. Lowest cost structure in the world at that time already for CapEx and OpEx. And a high national profile and self-esteem that Brazil already had 30 years ago. When I lived in the 80s, I could only feel that, the same I feel today. And there's a massive support from government. Well, Africa basically have these two. It's seen as a strong driver for rural economic development and tangible measure reducing dependence on oil import. But they don't have the rest. They don't have the industry. They don't have the government support. So what we have done, what we have learned, is that we have added that we have to both develop some massive comprehensive outgrower programs. You have to develop the local society. So you bring value to the local farmers. Secondly, you have to focus on the domestic market first. In this case, sugar first, then fuel. What are the problems? And I saw that in this invitation. Conflict with food production, environmental constraints, economic and social problems? No. I think everyone agrees today that developing this industry would actually not create any conflict with food. Another way around, it provides more food and more purchasing power. Deforestation and charcoal production is by far the biggest problem today. If we can produce ethanol and replace charcoal, they are by far the biggest ecological contribution. And there is no problem for social. Really, it's a challenge, but this is the driver for socio-economic development, as we heard also from other speakers from South America. A big problem, though, in Africa is about land and tenure of land, and also, I would say, capacity in government to handle these type of big investments. And that's why we also supported to set up a biofuels task force already in 2006, 2007, to create capacity for the government to increase the capacity for this. But still there is a capacity building, a need for that. The reality is that there is a much higher uncertainty in Africa. So if investors require 15% return on capital in Brazil, they require at least 20% return in Africa. The capex is definitely much higher because everything has to be imported, and that's why also the cost becomes higher. There is no existing market for ethanol. You can only have a very small market, and then you have to export it. However, it's very well compensated because the shortage of sugar has created a very high price market for sugar. So these high costs of capex and opex is well compensated now by the high prices for sugar. And also, there is a process of understanding that these countries are paying up to 45 cents per kilowatt hour by generating power from diesel today. And if they would take just half that cost and support the development of biomass producing, it would help to develop this industry over a 10-year period. And then can go down to whatever, 10 cents or so. That's a mental process to go through. What we have learned is that the opportunities are different. They are there. But actually they are more favorable than we originally thought. On the environmental side, by far the biggest opportunity is to use ethanol to replace charcoal. If you have a cubic meter ethanol and you replace gasoline, if you take the same cubic meter and you replace charcoal, the greenhouse gas effect is 3 times higher. But unfortunately, we don't know how to internalize those effects into money. That's a challenge for perhaps Rio Plus 20 to talk about. The biggest challenge today is really to reduce the perceived uncertainty to actually do a number of projects. There is a lack of belief in Africa. So everyone adds a lot of risk and makes it much more, let's say, uncertain and costly than it should be. The easiest way to reduce that is just to show by the number of projects. And it's not this food versus fuel issue that is being talked about. Focus to meet the true domestic drivers, domestic market first, as I said, that is growing extremely fast. And actually the Chinese have understood that. The Chinese are focusing on Africa not just a way to get resources. They're focused on Africa as one of the biggest growing markets in the world. There are more mobile telephones in Africa today than in North America. There are more mobile telephones in Africa than in Europe. And it grows extremely fast. Food first, then fuels. That's the perception today, and therefore it's a reality. When there will be a shortage of gasoline in the filling stations, that can shift quickly. But as long as there is fuel available at the filling station, fuel and sugar is the priority one. Local development includes smallholder outgoing programs. It's a must in order to make it socially sustainable. Stepwise development. You cannot roll in and make 40,000, 50,000 hectare project. You have to do it stepwise. I don't know where you end up, but you cannot do in a couple of years what Brazil have done in 40 years. Tenure of land has to be handled very carefully. And that's why I will share what we've done there. And then, of course, still it remains to build an industry that can be globally competitive, not being hiding behind import tariffs and so on. Final remarks. This is the last continent to be developed. It is by far the largest global potential for new arable land. It is just waiting. It's a geopolitical game. And that's what the Indians and the Chinese and the Indian has actually an official national policy to expand into these areas in Africa today. Serving whose interests? That's an important question. European Union should serve Brazil's interests, China, India, South Africa, or perhaps we should focus to service the host country's interests. I believe that those that can combine their own long-term interests as an investor and developer with the true needs of the local countries, they will be the successful ones. So what we have is that we have tried to develop partnerships. We won't export ethanol in the first projects. Everything will be used in the domestic market, probably also in the second project. But we do have access to guaranteed offtake to European market. We have government coming in as a part owner, even though it's symbolically. That is to do political, let's say, it's a political blessing that is about developing industry. Secondly, it's a focus to a first project. We were talking focus doing 10 projects initially, because not to only do one project, but to develop an industry.